So let me kick it off with our first two speakers. If you have your little programs, what I'm going to tell you is the very abridged version, because we don't have enough time to read all their bios. They're overwhelming. This is an ensemble of speakers that I've never seen before, and we were just fortunate to have been able to put it together with sort of 6 degrees of separation. So our first panelists are going to be coming out, Peter Hart and Michael Mandelbaum. Michael is an author or co-author of 16 books, including alongside of Thomas Friedman. I'm told that Thomas Friedman will only have his books read by 2 people, his wife and Michael, before they go to his printer or his publisher. He's been named the best nonfiction writer by Financial Times. He's at the Johns Hopkins as the foreign policy specialist. The New York Times named him one of the country's leading public intellectuals. Foreign Policy magazine named him one of the top global thinkers. Henry Kissinger said he's illuminating and thought-provoking. And my favorite is I saw him on the Daily Show being interviewed by Jon Stewart, so he's also funny. So that's our first part of this conversation. Peter Hart, one of the top analysts of public opinion in the United States. He formed Hart Research in 1971. He's a pollster to NBC and to the Wall Street Journal. His clients have a wide range from the Smithsonian to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's represented over 55 senators and 40 governors. This is usually when I say, so he's kind of to blame, but he's that guy. His resume is full, and he's got great style points. So he and Michael are going to talk about the world, which is our first theme for this part of the show, with a little bit of the U.S. thrown in. So please welcome Michael Mandelbaum and Peter Hart.
I'm Peter Hart, and delighted to be here, and I congratulate you on 33 1/3 years. I have to tell you that, to be perfectly honest, I was shocked to be invited here. I said, a pollster? Pollster can't see ahead more than 2 weeks. And I said, I don't get it, Mike. Why am I being invited here? He said, well, we're going to invite you until you get it right. So here it is, and I have to tell you, if I'd been here 33 years ago, I don't think I would have said the Giants are going to win 3 World Series. I certainly wouldn't have said Jerry Brown is going to be your governor. And you look at it, and I have to admit, in the Trump world, I didn't get it quite right, because I told my friends, if Trump is elected, I can tell you, you won't have to worry for long. And they said, what? I said, look, I can guarantee you within a year, he'll leave America for a much younger country. So here I am taking a look to see where we are, what's happening, and I'm going to sort of set up what I call the narrow focus of mine, which is politics and in general what's happening in America. Michael's going to take the heavy stuff. You're going to talk about where we're going, what the world's going to look like. So I'm going to take you through some slides of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And sort of where I want to start is what I think it's so central, and that is gender and the major step forward, what we've seen here. But it's also an indication on a very important thing, and that is that social change takes an awful long time. And it's important to be able to recognize that in that change of time, each thing is incremental. And I think if you go all the way back to 1972 and look at the Equal Rights Amendment, that essentially what you have is 36 states have ratified it, and 14 states are still a holdout. But that gave you a start as to where we were headed as a country and a major step forward. At the same time, what we find out is that population and participation in Title IX made all the difference in the world. And what we found out is that suddenly we had equal or almost equal participation over time. And that's an important understanding, important change, and all of it was leading to elected officials. And what I would tell you about elected officials, as much as anything else, is that we now have, I think, 23 United States senators who are female. 37 states have elected either governor or senator in their states. And it all goes back to a person I worked for named Ella Grasso. She was the first woman governor elected on her own right. And what's so interesting about this is the breakthrough told us so much about where we were at the time. Who were the single most biased people against having a woman governor? Women over the age of 50. And what they told us was it didn't have to do with Ella Grasso. It had to do with how they were treated as people. And so their big concern was that women would not respect a man. Men would not respect a woman governor. A woman would be able to get business for the state, and other states would look down. And essentially, they were telling us about themselves, so we had to talk to them in a way that said, hold it, Ella Grasso is different. And if you think about the direction of the country and how much change that we've gone through, you see this in terms of the nation and where it's gone. But you look, and I talk about social change taking time. And what you see here is the fact that the glass ceiling is still pretty thick all the way through. If you look at this, only 28 CEOs are female. In the Fortune Top 100, it is indeed only 7. And yet at the same time, I can tell you the future is going to be very different. And all you have to do is look at the future that we already know. In terms of the future that we already know, there are 10 million more women who've gotten, over the last 20 years, either graduate degrees or undergraduate degrees more than men. And it's that kind of change. And you look, and the ultimate change that we're seeing is the Me Too movement. And what the Me Too movement is really something goes far beyond just sexual harassment. What it really has to do with is in terms of equalization. And that is essentially when I do focus groups with people and I do focus group with women, the single biggest complaint that I get about their relationships in their companies with men is they will say something and it may be a good idea, but until a man repeats it, it somehow doesn't get accepted. And it's going to be the whole change of language, it's going to be the whole change of where things are at. So that, to me, is a major change. But there's a second change which we're going to talk about, and that is really about the polarization and the deconstruction within our society. You look in San Francisco, you're rare and you're marvelous because you're on the cutting edge of change, but you've always been on the cutting edge of change. For much of the nation, they are not. And we look at the electronic age, and indeed everything that we learn is all the effects of the advancement and everything that's gone on. But against that, we have a whole nother area that we can look at, and that is there's opioid addiction, church attendance is down, neighborhood relationships are down. Everyone's a publisher now, everyone's an activist now, but you look at this, and against that is all the time that we spend on this device. And it is, instead of necessarily bringing us together while we talk about that, the other side is it doesn't really happen. And you look, and when you recognize that we touch our phones an average of 2,600 times a day, it gives you just a sense of what's happening. And so the moorings of yesterday are being yanked away, whether it is neighborhood, whether it is family, whether it is religion. My favorite figure that I have is this, and that is that 52% of dog owners know their neighbor's dog's name, but not their neighbor's name. And that probably says it as much as anything else. How many people fall into that category? Yeah, okay. So you look at this, and the other issue of the day is indeed immigration. We're talking about it, and it's much like busing. was in the 60s. It's much like abortion was in the 80s. And we're in a transition period here. It's probably the most divisive issue that I have to deal with in terms of public opinion. And we've failed to solve it up to now. Obviously, when you think of the difference between Ronald Reagan, tear down that wall, and Donald Trump saying, build that wall, it's a sense that where we've gone. And what you have is many people say, look, this is really the future, and you look, and it tells us about the richness in terms of our society. And indeed, you look at the population and the changes with terms of immigration, it's important. It's doubled in terms of in terms of 2 generations. And you look at the change in the immigrant population. It's gone from, in 1965, 80% white, to a place that it's 80% non-white, and the difference that we have gone through. And what it says is, to some, it's the richness of the society, to other, it's the great problem. If you live in Wausau, Wisconsin, 10% of your population is Hmong. If you look, where are Somalians? 87,000 live in Minneapolis, 50,000 live in Columbus, and in Haitians, 140,000 live in Florida. It's all of that change and everything that's happening. And so what we find here is this division, and it's going to be a division that's not going to be solved easily. And it leads to what I want to talk about, which is the deconstruction of America. And the last panel is so marvelous, and they're great. And they talk about all the opportunities. But in order to get to all those opportunities, there's a lot that still has to be worked through in America. There is tremendous anxiety. There is a tremendous amount of insecurity. And the thing that we see more than anything else is polarization within our society. Polarization in so many ways, but the way in which I see it, obviously, is political polarization. So difficult, so hard to get to, and you have the money belt versus the belt tightening people. And the easiest way to look at it is on the right-hand side down here, and that is, when you think back, and Michael Dukakis, who lost to Bush 41, essentially got wiped out in that election. And yet he won West Virginia and he won Wisconsin. You look in 2016, the best state for Donald Trump was West Virginia, a have-not state, a state that has got more opioid problems than anybody else, a state which is yesterday and not tomorrow. Wisconsin struggling with all of their issues. They've become very Republican, much more red than they used to be. And as you see all of this happening, it is the picture that we're going through. So it's a picture of tremendous opportunity, tremendous amount of change, but in order to get there, we have to go through this period. And part of going through this period is learning to build back the bonds which we had before in gentler times, as we would say. It's family dinners, it's neighborhoods, it's faith, it's passions and pastimes, but you look, the trust that an American public has. So let me turn from here to sort of look ahead in terms of where we go. And I'm not going to deal with the big issues that our friends will deal with, but just instead touch upon sort of the political side of things. And a question that we have been measuring for about the last, I would say 35, 40 years, and here I represent since 1990, and that is, do you think the next generation is going to be better off than your own? How many people in this audience say their generation is better off than their parents' generation? How many believe that your children's generation is going to be better off than yours? Some hands, but what we see is essentially for the first time in 13 generations, we have only 1 in 5 Americans believing that things are going to be better off. And what you see here is that for so many generations, it's been a sense of upward, and we're going to talk about the future and where that is. But at this stage of the game, it is a question mark. So if I turn to sort of where we're going to go politically, I'm going to take a very optimistic look. And I think I would tell you optimistically because essentially the swamp's going to get overturned. To me, dark money explains what's happened. And if you look at this, essentially the degree that we believe in Congress is now down at 7%. There's a story which I think is true. John McCain was saying that now when Congress is believed by only about 7%, you're down to staff and family. And the next week, John came out and made a vote that irritated his mother. And she phoned and she said, "You're down to staff." So you look at this, and essentially what you find is that the public has had it up to here. Money is run amok in Washington. And I don't care if you're on the left and you say Tom Steyer's doing the right thing, or on the right and say the Koch brothers. They're both enemies from my point of view, because they've taken over and hijacked the system. And what the American public is looking is to take back the system one way or another. And what it comes down to is, I don't know if it's going to be the courts. I'm not sure how the legislation's going to work out. But one way or another, money is going to change, and it's not going to be seen like an auction as it is today. Second thing that I think is going to happen in terms of where we're going is probably the most bold, and that is, I think that we are going to elect an independent president. I don't know if it's going to be a Colin Powell type, or an Oprah type, or a Dwight Eisenhower type. One way or another, I think if in 2016, if Colin Powell had been on the ballot, my sense is he could have won the presidential election. There was that much antipathy for the candidates of each party. Everybody will tell me it's hard, it's impossible. They'll talk to you about the system. I think the system is going to feel a way to cleanse itself, because what's working in Washington and the way things are being run, the public is unhappy. And I think there's an openness and a willingness to see a new way. So with that kind of prediction, I want to give, I think, only fair, Michael, 4 predictions, things that you can say. Number 1, we'll have a woman president within the next 33 years. Number 2, I think electric cars will be the vehicle that everybody will be driving through. Third, men will be the principal parent in better than 40% of the households. Last, pro football will be replaced by the NBA and soccer as America's favorite sports. And I would tell you, I will be back here at age 109 to check it out. Thank you very much. All yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's to address this distinguished audience. In his introductory remarks, Michael made reference to the celebrated Dwight Clark catch. I grew up in the Bay Area, across the Bay in Berkeley, at the cutting edge of the baby boom, as an avid sports fan, an avid Bay Area sports fan. But my most vivid sports memories are the 49ers blowing a 27-7 halftime lead at Kezar in 1957 and missing their chance to win the NFL championship, and Willie McCovey lining out to the Yankees' Bobby Richardson with 2 out and the bases loaded in the 9th inning, allowing the Yankees to win the World Series. So I want to state for the record that I did the suffering, and you all have enjoyed the good times.
So true.
My remarks are intended to provide some context for what Peter said and perhaps for the remarks of subsequent speakers. The most powerful force affecting our economy and therefore our politics is what I would call the hurricane of change. Hurricanes in nature arise through the combination of low pressure areas and water vapor. And similarly, the hurricane of change has two component parts. One is globalization. The other is advances in technology, especially the revolution in information technology. Globalization involves the cross-border movement of goods, that is trade, money, finance, and people, immigration. It's certainly not new. Globalization first came onto the scene in earnest in the second half of the 19th century with the invention of the steamship, the railroad, and the telegraph. But in our own day, cross-border flows are vastly larger in volume than they were then, and far more of the world is closely involved in the globalization process than previously. In the 19th century, China was a very marginal participant in globalization, and now, of course, it is central. As for the IT revolution, well, that pervades our lives. We carry it around with us all the time. But what's important here is the way that it has upended and is upending one sector after another of our economy. It's had that impact on journalism as content migrates from the printed page to the web. It's had a comparable impact on manufacturing, leading to the joke that the factories of the future will involve only machines plus one man and one dog. The man will be there to feed the dog, and the dog will be there to make sure the man doesn't touch the machines. And of course, we've seen it in retail. In shopping malls across the country, there's more and more vacant space. And some malls are even being torn down and being replaced by apartment blocks. Well, the combination of the IT revolution and globalization has brought immense benefits. It's improved the lives of hundreds of millions, probably by this time billions of people. But the combination has also had some unhappy economic side effects. And it's had these side effects especially in the rich countries, and we are, of course, a rich country. Three in particular, I think, are worth mentioning. One is job loss. There are millions of jobs that Americans used to do and used to make good livings from doing that have now disappeared. Now, technological change has been with us for a long time, and it has always had the effect of destroying some jobs while creating others. After all, the internal combustion engine put a lot of blacksmiths out of work, but it also created jobs for auto mechanics. Well, with self-driving cars, auto mechanics are still going to be employed, but what about professional drivers? What are they going to do? Are there going to be new jobs for them to do? Will there be enough new jobs soon enough to give them work? Will they be good-paying jobs? Will they be jobs that former drivers have the skills to do? And what if, in an unlikely but at least conceivable case, the march of the cutting edge of information technology, namely artificial intelligence, does away with lots of jobs altogether? What if there simply aren't enough jobs to go around? If that turns out to be the case, we as a society face a profound economic, political, and I would say moral, existential challenge. Well, that all lies in the future, if it's going to come at all, but it's not all that distant a future. These are major questions. A second unhappy side effect is wage stagnation. Millions of Americans haven't had a raise for 2 decades and sometimes more. And third, the hurricane of change has had the effect of making us a far more unequal society than we were in the past. This is a much more unequal country in economic terms than it was in the 1950s when Peter and I were growing up across the bay in Berkeley. Now, these economic changes have evoked a political reaction, and not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. And the name that we give to that reaction is populism. And populism is everywhere you look in the Western world. It's in the United States, of course, through the presidency of Donald Trump. It appeared in Great Britain with the plebiscite in which the British people voted to leave the European Union, the so-called Brexit. It made an appearance in France in the most recent presidential election when the runner-up was the representative of a populist party, the National Front, Madame Marine Le Pen, and the winner, Emmanuel Macron, ran on the basis of a party that he created himself just a few months before the election. We see it now in Italy, where in the recent election, the two leading parties, the Northern League, or League as it now calls itself, from the north, and the Five Star Movement from the south, got the most votes and are trying to form a coalition. The person they nominated to be finance minister in their government was vetoed by the Italian president on the grounds that he would shatter confidence in the Italian economy and jeopardize its participation in the common European currency, the euro. So we now have a political crisis in Italy, and it's conceivable, not necessary, but conceivable, that that will lead to an economic crisis, and an economic crisis not just in Italy, but in Europe as a whole. And if that happens, that crisis will surely have ripple effects that will reach all the way to California. Well, it may well not come to that. We don't know how this is going to play out, but we can be pretty sure of one thing. As has already happened, there will be a flight from the euro into the safest global currency, the one presided over by Donald Trump, namely the dollar. So the dollar is going to strengthen, which means that this is the summer to take a European vacation. Your money will go further now than it did just a couple of weeks ago. There are also populist movements, populist parties, populist leaders in Germany, in Greece, in Austria, in Finland, in the Netherlands, in Austria, and elsewhere in Europe. Now, these various populist parties and leaders differ among themselves in many important ways, but they do have a common program. They are all against globalization. Donald Trump has severely criticized American trade deals, and the European populists all oppose, in one fashion or another, the European Union, which is, in its origins, at its core, a free trade area, although, of course, it's now far more than that. And, of course, populists everywhere object to immigration. Populists have enjoyed some modest success. The cross-border flows of trade and people have not expanded in recent years, and in some places they have actually contracted. But there are serious limits to what the populist program can do to satisfy the grievances of the people who vote for populists. For one thing, there are serious political limits on how far trade can be restricted. There is now in the United States political pushback. The Trump administration, for example, wants to impose tariffs on imported steel. But there are lots of American manufacturers who use imported steel. Tariffs will raise their costs and squeeze their profits, and they will protest, and they are already doing so. Similarly, there are a lot of exporters in America, and exporters don't like tariffs against imports because they fear, in most cases rightly, that this will cause other countries to which they export to put up trade barriers against American exports. So they will push back and are already doing so. But the major reason that the populist program cannot deal in any effective way with the hurricane of change is that by far the greatest impact of the hurricane of change comes not from globalization, but from technological change. It's technology that has done away with most of the jobs that have disappeared. We've had technological change for well over 2 centuries, and we can observe over those 2 centuries one clear pattern. It cannot be stopped. It has never been stopped. Populists want to build walls to keep out the hurricane of change, but technological progress, including artificial intelligence, will go over, under, around, and through those walls. It won't work. We need another strategy for coping with the hurricane of change, and that strategy has to revolve around adaptation. So let me say a few words about adaptation with particular reference to the United States. We have to adapt at 3 different levels: the national, the level of communities and firms, and the individual level. Nationally, there are a number of initiatives that I think are important, that would be constructive, but that are basically blocked by our toxic politics. In 2011, Tom Friedman and I published a book called That Used to Be Us: How America Fell Behind in the World It Invented and How It Can Come Back. In that book, we laid great emphasis on increasing the rate of economic growth, and we suggested, in order to do so, that the United States revive and refurbish its historic formula for public-private cooperation to promote economic growth. That formula includes better education, more and better infrastructure, immigration laws that attract talented foreigners to this country, investment in research and development, and sensible regulation and deregulation. But all of those things meet with political opposition, and in the 7 years since we published the book, not much has been done. We also need to refurbish our social safety net. In particular, we need to make it more generous, because my generation, the baby boom generation, has done so poorly at saving for retirement, and we need to broaden the social safety net to include provision for allowing people to upgrade their skills continually while still in the workforce as technology advances and makes the skills that they have obsolete. Well, refurbishing and revising the social safety net in that way would be expensive, and that's a problem because we really can't afford the social safety net we already have, with a large and growing national debt and with rising health care costs. We're going to be hard-pressed to pay for the social safety net we have, let alone make it more generous. A final initiative that I think is important in meeting the challenges posed by the hurricane of change is doing better at entrepreneurship. The days of the mega firms employing hundreds of thousands of people is probably at an end. In order to employ people, we're going to need lots and lots of small and medium-sized firms, and therefore we're going to need lots of people to establish those firms. Now, America has been, really since the 19th century, the global leader in entrepreneurship, but in recent years, the rate of business formation in the United States has declined, and we need to do something about that. As for the second level of adaptation, some of the most creative adapting is being done in communities. It's really communities and not the national government that are the strength of the United States. And this is especially true of university communities. Knoxville, Tennessee, the home of the University of Tennessee, is one of the most dynamic cities in the South. When the National Hockey League decided to put one of its franchises in the state of Ohio, it decided to put it not in Cleveland or Cincinnati, where all the other major league sports have their franchises, but rather in Columbus, which is not only the capital, but the home of the Ohio State University. I just read in the paper that Major League Soccer has decided to put a franchise in Cincinnati, but it already has a franchise in Columbus. As for firms, it is private firms that are doing the best job of adapting in the United States, and the reason is pretty clear. They have to. A private, profit-making firm that doesn't adapt will go out of business. As for individuals, well, every individual is going to have to take more responsibility for his or her continuing education. But there are changes in the educational sector that are necessary as well. The higher education part of that sector is the one with which I'm familiar, and there we face a number of challenges. One is cost. It's just too expensive now. Another is that we don't do at all well on continuing education. We take in young men and women in their late teens, we send them on their way in their early 20s, and we never see them again. That's not good enough anymore. And we need to figure out how to make the best use of information technology in higher education. In addition, individuals are going to have to be more entrepreneurial, and they're going to have to figure out ways to use the emerging platforms, the so-called gig economy, to take advantage of things like Airbnb, and there'll certainly be more of them, to supplement their incomes. So there are enormous challenges here. So where does that leave us? Well, the hurricane of change, I think, especially technological change, is not going to die down anytime soon. It's going to be with us for the foreseeable future. The United States is a country whose institutions and whose DNA equip it to cope with the challenge of the hurricane of change probably better than any other country. We are in a good position. But despite that, there will be failures, there will be problems, and there will be lots of people who will be left behind. There'll be a lot of political turbulence, which means, I believe, that the populism of the present moment is likely to continue for some time to come. Thank you.
Good. That was great. Let me ask you a question.
Please.
And that's my business. I ask questions. And that is, you know, as you look at this, I mean, the major problem is that government hasn't invested. We haven't invested in the environment, we haven't invested in education, and we haven't invested in our infrastructure. As you see this next era, what's going to allow us to make the investments? How are we going to turn around and start to deal with that?
Well, that is the $64 trillion question. And since you're the expert in politics on the stage, it's probably more appropriately addressed to you. But before I throw it back to you, let me hazard a tentative answer. Of course, when Tom Friedman and I wrote That Used to Be Us, we just assumed that that would solve all the problems. It would sell millions of copies. People would see that we were right. It would transform our politics. For some unknown reason, that didn't happen. Two things. Crises tend to concentrate the mind of the country. And another serious economic crisis, similar to the one in 2008, might provide the opportunity for doing some things that ought to be done anyway. It was Rahm Emanuel who said a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. It's not the optimal way to get the change you need, but it may be the only way. Second, in That Used to Be Us, Tom and I had a chapter proposing an independent presidential candidacy. Now, we argued that an independent candidate, contrary to what you've said, cannot win. But if an independent candidate does well enough, that candidate's agenda will be adopted by the winner so as to have a broader coalition the next time. And that is a recurrent feature of American history. Theodore Roosevelt did not win the 1912 election, but he ran as a passionate populist, and Woodrow Wilson was much more progressive in office than he would have been otherwise. George Wallace's vote in 1968 gave Nixon the so-called Southern strategy, and Ross Perot's good showing in 1992 made Bill Clinton a deficit cutter. So we thought that if we could get a candidate to adopt our program And if that, and which is a very big if, of course, and if that candidate could get 15 to 20% of the vote, that would change the politics of the country, which, of course, also didn't happen. So let me ask you, Peter, as somebody who's worked on these issues for a long time and has a very large store of accumulated wisdom.
Where did that wisdom come from?
From all the people you've interviewed
That's exactly right.
over all the years. Is anything like that plausible? And whether or not it's plausible, what, if anything, do you see changing the politics of the country in order to make it possible to be serious about the things that we need to do as a country to adapt to this hurricane of change?
Well, the problem is we're in the worst period of polarization that I've seen. I've been doing, and I'm talking partisan polarization. There's always been polarization economically and in other ways. But when it comes to partisan polarization, you can't underestimate just how divided we are in terms of reds and blues. And yes, we've always had this, and you live in San Francisco, in the San Francisco environment, and so you only know blue. There is no such thing as red. But you look, and essentially, there is nobody that's willing to work across the aisles now in a big way. There is nobody that is strong enough in terms of doing things. I mean, one of the examples is the only people who have taken on Donald Trump are those people who are Republicans who are retiring. Otherwise, there's nobody that's out there that's willing to do this. And in order to get there, somehow you need a Margaret Chase Smith, who was the female senator from Maine who was willing to stand up to Joe McCarthy in her own party, and was the first, and obviously turned the tide. We don't have that set of people that are out there. And to give you a sense of the polarization, I did a focus group just recently in Milwaukee. And I do something called a lightning round, where I just throw out names of various people, and they gave me a word or phrase to describe those people. And I decided to put John McCain's name in there. And this was a group that was evenly divided, Democrats and Republicans. And the Democrats, as I hit them, would talk about patriotic, served his country, somebody they admired. 4 of the 6 Republicans in the group said something negative about John McCain. Their standard bearer 10 years earlier, somebody who is obviously dying, and they talked about him as being a turncoat, an old man, all of these things, and it came from Fox, and it comes from the President of the United States. And essentially, to figure out how you get something where you bring the country together, it seems to me you need an outside crisis. And what we do is, in Washington, push everything back. And what's happening at this stage of the game is money's overflowing in each and every element. You talked about the uniqueness of the Marshall Plan. And what was it that allowed us to sort of get to a place that America, being spent to its knees in World War II, felt that there was a need to put money into Europe and to be able to save it? What was it about that generation, or what was it about the politics then that allowed that to happen?
Well, Peter's referring to an essay I recently wrote about a very good book on the Marshall Plan. This was officially known as the European Recovery Program. It was a multi-billion-dollar grant to Western Europe in 1947, from 1947 through 1950, to help Europe recover from the ravages of World War II, and it was remarkably successful. But what is striking is that the American government functioned very, very well. It saw the need, it put together a plan, it negotiated with the European governments, and not least, it sold it in the Congress and the country. What was the secret of that? If I had to put it in one word, or 3, it's World War II. Everybody was involved in the war effort. All the best people were working more or less selflessly to defend the country, to defend democracy, between 1942 and 1945, and that carried over. People were used to working with other people and not knowing what their party affiliation was. It was an emergency, and everybody pitched in. And then, in 1947, the concern spread in the American government that if Europe didn't recover, the communists would be able to take over in Western Europe through their large communist parties, and the Soviet Union would therefore control all of Europe, all the way to the Atlantic, which would confront the United States with precisely what it had gone to war to prevent in 1942, namely a united hostile Europe. So the sense of emergency that had galvanized people in World War II carried over to the Marshall Plan, and the government performed in a way that's just inconceivable today. But fortunately or unfortunately, mainly fortunately, we can't manufacture a crisis like that today. In the absence of one, well, I'm not sure what we can do.
Well, we hear from everybody out there. If you've got questions, thoughts, raise your hand and have at it. We won't make it just a dialogue between us. It's hard to. I see a hand. Am I seeing a hand up there? It's hard to. If you stand up.
Yes, and the acoustics are good here, so you don't need a mic.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks very much. It was very inspiring. Michael, my question is to you. I was really intrigued by the choice of language, hurricane of change and adaptation, and I wonder if you could comment on climate change and the forecast impact on the world from that, and how you see that relative to the other crises we talked about.
My friend and co-author Tom Friedman, in his most recent book, puts climate change on a par with what I've called the hurricane of change, with globalization and the IT revolution. I didn't include it in my remarks, partly because I didn't have time, but I think that there is a difference. And I think that climate change is going to have the most pronounced and most devastating effects, and is already having them in poor countries, in poor parts of the world, in countries that depend heavily on agriculture, in countries that don't have the resources to adapt. If the sea levels rise to the level that cities on the east and west coast get flooded, we'll move them. It'll be expensive, it'll be terrible, it'll be a crisis, but we can do it. In sub-Saharan Africa, when there is drought, and there has been drought repeatedly in the last few years, there's really nothing they can do except to leave. And African countries are emptying out and heading north across the Mediterranean to try to get to Europe, because Europe represents to them a lifeline, the only way of earning enough money to feed their families. So the most powerful immediate impact is, I believe, on poor countries. One of the problems in Syria, one of the things that led to the Syrian civil war, was climate change that made agriculture in much of Syria impossible. People crowded into the cities. There were no facilities for them. They were mistreated there, and they rebelled. So climate change is already having a geopolitical impact. It has had a devastating impact in the Middle East and Africa. It will get worse. The rich countries closest to ground zero of the impact of climate change are in Europe, and they will feel the effects. I'm not saying that we will escape scot-free, but I think that climate change will have much more pronounced negative effects in other parts of the world.
And the sad thing is, in terms of American public opinion, they haven't recognized this at all. I mean, we were much closer to a recognition of what we needed to do back in the 70s and early 80s than we are today. So as it gets worse, the public becomes less aware. And what's particularly interesting is I asked in this focus group about Scott Pruitt. And you would think, boy, you will get a blowback coming there. 12 people in the room, not one person knew Scott Pruitt. Not one single person. So you say, oh my God, what a horror. But the horror is that they really don't know, and they haven't followed it, and they don't appreciate where it's at. Other thoughts?
I just got through reading a book called Homo Deus by Harari,
Well, it would argue that, and we don't know what to do about it. People who write about artificial intelligence, and I've read a number of books on the subject, although I have not read that one, tend to be enthusiasts and tend to make great claims about how far and how fast it's going to go. And some of you may be familiar with the term general artificial intelligence that can deal not just with one task, but with any task that is capable of learning, that's like human intelligence except 1,000,000 times more powerful, at which point the question becomes, what use are human beings, and will we all survive as a species? I'm a bit skeptical that that's going to happen anytime soon, if at all, but we don't know. But there are studies, really kind of seat of the pants, blue sky forecasting, that as many as 50% of all jobs will be done by machines. We know, as I said, that technology destroys jobs, but it also creates them. And it is, just as it's destroying jobs, IT is creating jobs. There are lots of jobs now that were never imagined back in 1984 when TMG got started. The questions, I think, are the ones that I mentioned in my prepared remarks. Will there be enough new jobs fast enough? Will the people who lose their old jobs be able to do the new jobs? Will the new jobs pay a living wage? But it is possible. I don't know how likely it is. I don't think anybody really knows. But it may be, it is at least conceivable. It's somehow not purely science fiction anymore, although I don't think it's quite moved into the realm of reality either, that human beings will become obsolete for an awful lot of jobs, and we have no idea what to do about that. That's a philosophical challenge, I guess, that our species has never faced, if it ever comes to pass.
I have to say, stay around for the third panel. They will sell exactly what's coming ahead and the positive elements that will be built. So I think that's equally exciting, and it shouldn't be looked at as only a negative. Other thoughts?
I wanted to ask you, your comments about the Marshall Plan were really interesting. And one of the things then was, with me growing up, we had 3 television stations and that was it. I wonder what your comment is to the media and the myriad of messaging and how we could ever get behind something as a country.
Can I pick that up?
Please.
Let me pick it up first, and then we'll go to Michael. But all I can tell you is that in doing the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, we now actually put as a banner point that we look at all the data by, whether you watch MSNBC or whether you watch Fox. And it is like listening to 2 different nations. There is no commonality between the two. And you can say, well, which things do they like and what are their priorities? All of those things are different. I mean, and that, when you stop to think about how far things have changed from the days when Walter Cronkite was the most trusted person in America. Today, at this stage of the game, the reason that the President of the United States is able to call fake news and yell it out is because everybody believes it. And when I say everybody believes it, essentially, for those who are on the right, they look at everybody on MS, Rachel Maddow, et cetera, and they say that's fake news, and you turn it around and it's Hannity, et cetera. And we're no longer providing the news, we're providing rooting sections. And I don't know what you use as your basic stations, but in terms of television, outside of the BBC, it's pretty hard to find something that comes across as totally objective. Michael? Thoughts?
Well, there's an old rule in political science and history: no middle class, no democracy. The strength of this country really from colonial times, is what we would recognize, in a way, as a middle class. People are not rich, not poor, property owners, business owners, professionals. And one of the things that we've seen because of the hurricane of change, because of inequality, is, I wouldn't say a hollowing out of the middle class, but a diminution of the middle class. The middle class is really, has been, and as I say, even before the Industrial Revolution, even in colonial times where social categories are really quite different, but a kind of a middling group of people. We never had an aristocracy. We didn't have the devastating poverty of, say, 18th century London. People who were poor in 18th century London would come to the United States and they could get some land. So the larger and healthier the middle part of our society is, the healthier our society is, and anything that erodes that middle, I think, is bad for our country.
And if I'm correct, I remember reading some material which said, I think there were 140 metropolitan areas where the middle class has declined, and in those communities, the population of either the upper class and the lower class have increased. In other words, so what we have is more rich, more poor, and fewer people in the middle, moderate income. Couple final questions. Yep.
Could you address the aging population issue and the effect on the demographics of the economies that we're going to experience?
You're an older guy, so you might want to take that on.
Yeah, this issue has become personal for me. The United States is actually not an aging society in the sense that European societies are. We are replenishing ourselves because we have a higher birth rate than the Europeans do. And when you add in immigration, we're above the replacement rate of 2.1 live births per female. So we're maintaining our population, but we have more and more old people, and that's a serious issue. We'll hear more about the medical aspects of that in a subsequent session. But it's obvious that it's a political and economic problem because we're going to have increasing difficulty paying for Social Security and Medicare. We have to get a handle on health costs, and there have been moments when it looked as if that was happening, but we haven't really done it. And the effect of rising entitlement costs with the aging of the baby boomers is to squeeze out all the other so-called discretionary spending at the federal level that we need for the projects that are important for adapting to the hurricane of change. Europe is in much worse shape. In no European country is the birth rate above 2, and in some European countries it's closer to 1. There's a mordant joke in Germany, will the last German to leave please turn out the lights? The Germans are not replacing themselves, and neither are the French, and neither are the British, and if you go, the further east you go, the worse it gets. So they have more generous social safety nets and far more unfavorable age ratios. So they've got a problem that looks almost insoluble. Our problem is soluble with the kind of political will that's nowhere in sight.
There's an encouraging note to end our hour on. We have a lot of encouraging news coming from the others, so thank you all very much. Michael, good job.
Well done, Peter.
Thank you very much.
Let's go out there.